What's emerging, it seems to me, is a sort of second generation of thinking about these issues, in the sense that if you think back to those gay liberation movements in the 60s and 70s in the West, in Australia or America or the UK or whatever, it was all about dressing up as a nun and roller skating into psychiatric conferences. There's that kind of, that was the general approach, wasn't it? There was a kind of shock and awe kind of drag kind of thing going on, or there was sort of radical lesbianism going on and separatism, all that kind of stuff. And actually there was an interesting transition when people started to pick up on what Marta's saying, and Björg to some extent, and in fact all four of you, is that actually there's a need to understand how the politics work, and to understand how the politics work in particular countries. And there's not this separation between funding the activists and the grassroots or doing something with, the political elites or whatever. But actually the strategy needs to understand how, if we can play a role in supporting activists to have a sophisticated relationship with the politics of their country so they can bring about practical change. I mean, that's the real challenge, isn't it? And certainly that's one of the things Kaleidoscope's trying to do, as I say, sort of in Trinidad and Tobago, which was a very peculiar experience. Just to give you a little anecdote there, the person who was the real motivator in founding Kaleidoscope, Lance Price, who is a political journalist and worked in government here, went to speak to the Conference of Political Journalists in Trinidad and Tobago. He met the Prime Minister. She wanted to meet Tony and Cherie Blair, as it happened, but she wanted to have a relationship with some people here in Britain, of senior people, Tony and Cherie, well, big names. So Lance said, well, actually, we can make that work, because he'd worked for Tony Blair in office. And he said to the Prime Minister, by the way, if I told your immigration service that I was gay, they wouldn't have let me in, because that's part of your immigration laws. This is a bad thing. And we then wrote to her to say that. She then wrote back, expressing shock and dismay about this, and saying she didn't think this was a good situation, she would do something about it. It was quite complex to make that relationship between people on the ground and her office, but that's the process that we then set about trying to do. Now, it was an odd one, but it relates to colonialism, the Commonwealth, a whole series of interrelationships there. But actually what it's been part of doing is trying to ensure access by activists to their own political dynamic. And that, I just think that's an interesting story. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. So, I mean, that's part of the case you're making, isn't it? Just in the room, who feels that... well, let's explore this thing about whether this notion of funding the grassroots. Let me ask you, what should we be, if we've got money and they're asking for money, what's the conversation about the best investment of the money? Somebody said earlier on, don't pretend that it's not a donor-donee relationship. It is. We have some of the money, and there is a conversation that we'll have about what we do with the money that's coming from here, because there are domestic, political and other agendas here. So what is the best investment in different countries, from people's experience, in helping them to achieve the kind of real change we're looking for? Is that a good place to start? Hands up. There, and then there, and then there's somebody over there, and then there's somebody over there. Hang on a second, we'll get to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Laurie Adams. I'm here with two hats. One, I work for Oxfam, but in my private life, I'm part of a startup of an LGBTI trust in Southern Africa. I've been in South Africa since 1990. And what the new foundation is, a direct answer to your question, is beginning to look at in terms of our first round of grant making is two things. One is better understanding and supporting people within faith-based institutions to mobilize for change. Because if you think that the way the change came about in the World Bank or USAID or wherever is also from internally within institutions, how do we support that? And that comes out of an analysis. I want to say something about the backlash question. One of our board members, Carla Sutherland, who works out of Colombia, but who's from Southern Africa, has done some work looking at the new alliance between different conservative religious forces. So the first time there's a formal alliance between the Holy See and the Orthodox Greeks, and we need to not understand just better data, not just data evidence, but also better analysis of what are the forces, who's mobilizing, and where are the allies. So out of that analysis of, it's a backlash, but it's an organized, systematic backlash against secular human rights, starting with the edge of LGBTI, which is an easy win in many cultures, but actually is part of a broader strategy. So if that's true, how do we, so one is to work within faith-based, and the other is cultural. I was talking to a woman from Zimbabwe a couple weeks back, and the reason it's more public in Africa isn't just the backlash. It's also because of social media and connections, and because people are connecting with each other and therefore safer to meet up, and therefore more aware of possibilities and more safe spaces, she said. And also we all meet in global conferences, and human rights defenders meet each other, and then there's funding and linkages. So I think the movement is also stronger. I think there are more people who are out in semi-private places. So I think that's also part of it. So I think it's important to support those spaces as well, not just the hardcore activist grassroots groups, but grassroots faith, grassroots socials, grassroots.
Thank you. If you could pass it to the lady behind. But it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the two things we haven't talked much about are God and mammon. I mean, no one's really mentioned business very much, and then we ought to, at some stage, talk about, what role they can, can't, and certainly want at the moment to play.
Hi, I'm Felicity Daly. I'm a doctoral candidate at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And so to take the grassroots piece first and then focus on an area of development aid, health ODA, let me go to the front first. I wanted to ask the donors on the panel. When we use a community-based approach of LGBT, and we're trying to focus on health rights, and health funding is very focused on health metrics and the research and evidence base. So Fabrice said, we've got 5% of funding for these interventions focusing on research. You get yourselves into a catch-22 a lot of the time. And I think what we're seeing in LGBTI funding for health in many cases is some interventions, mainly around men who have sex with men in HIV prevention, both concerned about that community and partnerships and sexual networks in that community, but also as a linking population to generalized epidemics. And you'll have, to take the grassroots piece, in another South African example, the South African National AIDS Council, there is an LGBTI sector funded in that council to advocate for the needs of the entire community. And what is, because funding is now started from USAID, from PEPFAR, from a few other donors, Gates Foundation as well, to focus on MSM-oriented interventions, now it's a loop around programmatic and efficacy, and not advocacy for the entire needs of the community. You've got a burden in that community of trans persons, and my research is focused completely on the STI and HIV prevention needs of women who have sex with women. So I think we still need to get out of some of our boxes that we're getting into, particularly with a health ODA lens, and Elizabeth Mills said.
So you're saying that people will fund LGBT sexual health needs, and that'll be it. It'll be very, very narrowly focused, and that goes on in a series of silos. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, we use LGBTI, but we're not focusing on the needs of our entire community. Okay. We're responding to evidence that we have, health metric evidence that we have on
Is it because the evidence is not good enough?
Because the evidence base is not growing. Okay. Not because we don't have anecdotal evidence and a global evidence base we could tap into, but because we're not funding research on the ground about the health burdens in communities.
Thanks very much. Guy right at the back there. Sorry to make you rush across the room, but and we'll take those three, and then we'll do some more.
Hi, my name's Howard Mollett. I work for CARE. It's a multi-mandate development and humanitarian organisation. We work in 80 countries around the world, and it's the kind of organisation that I hope will get much better at addressing these issues. We do a lot of work on gender justice and gender-based violence, and we're starting to think through, and we do some very interesting work on LGBT in some contexts, but nowhere near enough. And one of the questions that's come out, and I'm glad that Bissy came back because he raised this in an event in SOAS a while back, putting you on the spot again, on the sort of question of allies that I think goes to the theme that you wanted to explore now. And I wanted to throw that back to the donors on the panel, in that it's important to support LGBT activists, but what work have donor institutions done to look at how they're funding, for example, broader gender justice movements, women's rights organizations, sort of traditional development actors, on how they can help, where appropriate, understand who those allies might be, whether that's women's rights organisations or organisations on the more conservative end.
Well, let's just go to Washington for a moment. I've always wanted to say that. So exciting, like me on the Today programme. So Fabrice, you're there, and Ajit, you can still hear and everything? Let me throw first to Fabrice. Two big questions. I mean, one is from the colleague just then about whether or not you fund, in a sense, how would you let's make it positive. So how would you fund more broadly to build the kind of alliances that you were talking about? And Fabrice, you made the point, 80% of people in the room are gay or whatever. So number one is that. And the second question is if you could also, which in a sense is an extension of it, but how do you then fund and invest in the capacity of those activist groups on the ground to intervene in a sophisticated manner in their own political dynamics? So Fabrice and then Ajit.
The answer is going to be pretty easy for the World Bank, right? Which is that we, unfortunately, do not provide any fund to strengthening civil society, right? So, unfortunately, the World Bank, mostly works through governments, and that's kind of an issue. So usually, when it comes to strengthening civil society, it will fall on other partners, right? And I believe that's a very important part of the job. One thing I've observed, which is kind of sad, is that a lot of the time, my colleagues that are country managers have good relations with, women organizations. They have good relations with organizations representing, ethnic minorities. But they don't have very good relation with sexual minority groups. I can count on my hand the number of country managers that have met sexual minority groups, and I think the reason is that often the sexual minority groups, in the countries are not as sophisticated as the other group, and there is many reasons for that. One of the reasons is, first of all, that they have been, extremely oppressed throughout the years. Then the other reason is that, funding, as someone mentioned, most of the funding has gone through the HIV prism, which has left out a lot of segments of the organizations, right? We know that lesbian organizations, are very weak. Right now, we are trying to carry out a survey in India, and we are trying to find a lesbian partner organization, and it's very difficult because the ones that are structured are the male groups that receive, HIV money. So we find ourselves in a situation where we have nascent groups that, unfortunately, a lot of their leaders are leaving the country because of the strong backlash that they're experiencing at the moment. And so I think, it's very much needed to support them. And there is also a risk that needs to be mentioned, is that when you focus on this organization, there is a risk of focusing on the golden child, right? And we have to keep in mind that very often the organization we focus on are the ones that represent the white, male, extremely educated ones that does not always represent the needs of the entire community. And we have to make the difficult effort sometimes of having to go and strengthen organizations that are not the most obvious ones, that are not the first ones that are out there. But then, unfortunately, the World Bank cannot provide that type of support because its links with civil society are very weak. Okay. But I really do believe that it's very important for my colleagues to make an effort and try to build ties with those groups to understand what is their experience in terms of development.
So the crucial point also would be that in order to make a case to the World Bank, you've got to, in a sense, make a case which is linked to the economy of the country and the level of poverty that exclusion and stigma creates. And in a sense, that is the only way to make the case within the context of the way in which you and the IMF and others work.
I think the World Bank is changing a little bit. And, the World Bank used to have this very artificial dichotomy, that it didn't look at human rights, it only looked at development. Now we have the proof that there is such a strong link between poverty and human rights violation. And today, the mission of the World Bank has changed. The World Bank's goal now is to eliminate extreme poverty and boost shared prosperity. Right. And you cannot achieve that if you do not look at human rights. And you cannot achieve that if you do not look at the fact that there is a vicious cycle in which people, human rights are violated, and then they are trapped in a cycle of poverty. And I think, even though, as I have mentioned, there is a huge lack of data, from the anecdotes they have, as well as the small surveys that LGBT organizations carry out, it is my impression that sexual minorities are trapped in this cycle.
Okay.
That their sexual orientation and their gender identity affect, tremendously their livelihoods. And I think, a first step, which is very important for me, is to document how sexual orientation and gender identity does affect people's livelihood and how it affects, their potential to reach the full potential of their lives.
Thank you. Thank you. Ajit, I mean, a similar question to you, really, but I mean, presumably USAID can fund civil society and can think about those kind of broader questions of how those groups create alliances and influence politics, or would you take a view that you have to be politically more neutral than that? I think you have to press a button somewhere because we're seeing you just in mime now.
One of the fundamental things one of the fundamental areas I would say that we really began our work is using political economy analysis, and I know that we've done this with colleagues at ODI as well in terms of creating our framework. And so the political part is, of course, important. At the end of the day, we are a bilateral donor development agency. We are part of the US government. So yes, there is that political context. However, a political economy analysis is one tool where we can look at different actors and see what is indeed possible. Now, the issue of strategic alliance building, I think, is a critical one, and this is what I would say. I love this pithy phrase. It's relationship before task. And so in every country context, when we're designing these country strategies based on these analytical frameworks in each of our technical sectors, what we do look towards is to see what we can do in terms of supporting local civil society actors. A couple of examples come to mind where I would say we've looked at that approach when it comes to intersectionalities. In Colombia, we've supported at the national level an organization that's doing important work in terms of moving the LGBT movement at the national level. At the kind of the more local level, we've supported an organization that's helping communities who are Afro-Caribbean descendants and looking at the particular violence and stigma and discrimination that they face. We've also worked with transgender women as well. And then fourth, in this example, is that of political candidate training. So I would say what we do is we have a multi-sectoral, broad-based approach where all different kinds of civil society organizations can participate in our development sectors and all of our technical sectors. So it's not a siloed activity, and it's a very integrated and inclusive one.
Thank you. Bill, can I just ask you too about there was one thing about the Norwegian embassies, and I mean it's worth noting that in the UK, of course, the embassies have three things that they're supposed to focus on. They're supposed to focus on security, trade, and human rights. And I mean, I remember going once to I went to Latvian Pride. I mean, which I have to tell you, well, it's small. That's the main thing about Latvian Pride, but it's very, very enthusiastic because there's not very many people in Latvia. That's why it's small, but quite a lot of them came out. But the interesting thing was that the British Embassy and the Canadian Embassy, and probably the Scandinavians, I don't know, were very instrumental in the political operation of moving the equivalent of the Home Secretary into a position where he was kind of fine with this. And I mean, it was just an interesting process to watch, and they used a letter to the newspapers and so on. But they had an explicit mandate, and I just wonder whether that's part of the success and what you've used.
Certainly.
And how did how do the countries that you're operating in, how did they respond to that mandate?
Thanks. And there's a lot to say about that. But yes, of course, political leadership is very, very important. And the embassies respond to instructions from headquarters. So when the Minister of Foreign Affairs, or the Prime Minister in our case, from Oslo sends an instruction to all the embassies, you are going to focus on LGBT rights, and you will score badly at home if you don't. Clearly, I mean, that's a great incentive for people in embassies to work on that issue. And tools were then prepared, like the guide I mentioned, which is available if you'd like to see it. So of course, yes, I think that's one ingredient in embassy involvement. The other is someone mentioned internal, I think it was from USAID or the World Bank, the internal capacity building. Don't just assume that the staff of an organization, even from a progressive country like Norway, immediately understand the issues at play. So training for staff, and again resource material. And then finally, trying to be a bit nimble in country and have the connections and the contacts with local organizations if they exist, because this can be difficult some places, or activists or communities, to make sure that whatever support you provide doesn't backfire. I mean, we've heard it previously, but it's worth reiterating. And so you'd find, you mentioned taking part in the Pride in Latvia, you'd find someone from the Norwegian embassy present at David Kato's funeral in Kampala. Recently there has been a court case in Zambia. 2 men been charged with homosexuality. They were acquitted, thank goodness, just a week ago or so. The donors in Zambia got together and said, how can we support, well, the issue in general, but now this court case in particular, and decided there'll be no more than 4 of us in the room, in the court at any given time, because we don't want to give this impression of Western imposition. So it's really, complex, sensitive diplomacy. Yeah. Because, of course, if you come from Norway, you want to do lots of stuff. But you can't go around banging heads because it won't help. So it's really, again, back to the...
Yeah, we're all heartily sick of how liberal you are, actually. We never look at, every time there's a liberal cause, who's funny? Oh, it's the Scandinavians again.
But can I say one more thing on that? And that links quite nicely to the other point I wanted to make that has to do with silent diplomacy. So as a country, you have access, obviously, to partner countries' governments. And I think there's great learning, again, that there's a lot you can do in creating safe spaces, even for politicians and ministers, because they might be able to have more nuanced conversations in a closed space, which we do.
Again, one of the things that Kaleidoscope has been doing is working with the High Commissioners. I mean, the reason to work on the Commonwealth is because of the concentration of countries within the Commonwealth who have laws that discriminate. We have a very particular relationship with the Commonwealth, but actually those meetings with the High Commissioners, which are confidential and open, and their staff, are a very useful way of helping us and them to understand the potentials of the way forward. And there are, of course, progressive voices in the Commonwealth, and the next heads of Commonwealth government will be happening in Malta, and Malta's a progressive country in relation to this, and so you do move those things on in a kind of careful way.
Could I just
certainly may
pick up on that again. I think someone mentioned the issue of working with or the importance of working with allies. You have in the UN context, it's quite clear who the proponents are of the traditional values resolutions in the Human Rights Council, or the recent resolution on family values. We might not move them, but there are a lot of countries in the middle that we can work with, and we are. One challenge that we're seeing is that, for example, a number of African governments have signed up to some great regional declarations. But when they come to the UN, they say something else in the negotiation room. We have to be careful not to impose Western values, but accountability mechanisms around these processes might be useful. I hope I'm not being too Western or imposing.
Sunil made the point, didn't you, that actually you could use those things, and you used, Nepal, they used the UN a great deal to
and I think they are useful, and also the issue of safe spaces for faith leaders, traditional leaders, others who might have problems in coming out too strongly in support of these issues immediately, is something that we're supporting through intermediaries. Somebody asked how to do that.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, Marta, do you have anything to add? I mean, particularly, I think, in relation to sort of the powers that should not be, and business as well, which are two clear sort of spheres where we need to have traction that we probably, at this stage, have only developing traction.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. I mean, since I mentioned my discomfort with sort of quickly focusing on grassroots and civil society as the main issue, I mean, in this discussion, sort of faith-based organization, it hasn't come up, but I think, probably traditional leaders in a number of countries. employers and business people, when we're talking about change in behavior, are probably as important, if not more. And finally, politicians. I mean, there is an important distinction between giving aid to a government and funding a government is the right thing. Whether you do that or not, the fact you need to work with politicians, probably behind closed doors, either to provide safeguard for those who are genuine reformers or to help them negotiate, different position, is an important task. So these are the kinds of things that we need to keep in mind when talking about aid. It's not just who do you give money to, but who do you work with. In most cases without much money, but with a lot of time and capacity and patience to make things happen. It strikes me that perhaps, therefore, as usual, posing the question as aid has a bit of a problem in it, because clearly aid here is only part of the story. I mean, the silent diplomacy, the working with, in Latvia, working, behind the scenes to get the Home Office to move, the networking, having the contacts, the negotiation. These are all functions that external actors and countries and donors can play, and probably in this field has as much importance as giving aid to domestic actors. And yes, and the final one was about the working with the politicians, which is something we should never.
Well, interesting. There's a question online actually from Andy Woodfield at PwC. One of the big four consultancies there. How should donors and those working in developing countries protect their own LGBT staff working in challenging countries? And that would be true of employers too. Has anybody worked on that at all and got any experience of being in business and abroad? There's the.
I know I've had it already, but not of being in business. But one of the things that the Alliance has done recently is that we've convened a roundtable for business organisations who are specifically those who are working in countries that have introduced legislation recently. And off the back of that, it looks like there is going to be a kind of relatively formalised global working group of businesses where they can, because there is some expertise out there already, so where they can pull this together.
So tell us a bit about what their dilemmas were. This is presumably about staff who were HIV positive or whatever.
No, not at all. So, I mean, we work on a broader LGBT rights agenda, although we're a HIV organisation, and it was really, it was looking at a couple of things. On the one hand, it was looking at dangers for their staff, where they have LGBT staff in country, around possible prosecution and other issues. And actually, the terms of the Uganda Act are so broad that you have what is the word that they use? But it's basically aiding and abetting homosexuality. Yeah. So, I mean, effectively, by allowing somebody to bring their civil partner to a country where they're working, you could be aiding and abetting. I mean, the terms are so broad you don't know.
I think wearing a cardigan as a man is aiding and abetting homosexuality these days.
Well, in our workplace, we provide condoms and lube. It's around the office. So that could be aiding and abetting.
So what were the businesses saying they felt able to do?
So there were two issues that came up, as I say. One was around the legal implications in country, and then the other one was around the risks of exposure. And some people might know about what happened with Orange, who were advertising in the Red Pepper newspaper, which was in the days after the Act was signed, were outing people in their hundreds, and Smug, one of our partners in the country, was documenting a huge surge in violent attacks and evictions on people because they were being outed. So really putting people in danger of lynching. So we worked with All Out, which is a global LGBT equality campaigning platform online. They ran an action targeting Orange, asking them to withdraw their advertising from Red Pepper, and they withdrew it very quickly. They did so within a matter of days, and it really demonstrated that there's a risk of exposure where a company may have a huge LGBT customer base here in the UK, but might be doing something that's kind of unethical.
And do you know anything about what the response was in Uganda to that action by a global company?
Well, so it was interesting because I think the director of or the owner of Red Pepper, obviously came out with the same kinds of statements that are going around in Uganda in general, where he was saying, well, we don't need, if these people are promoting homosexuality, we don't need their funding, and they're promoting their anti-Western agenda. But I think, that narrative might change if we see more multinationals doing the same thing. And another company who did it without even being targeted was I think it's SABC, South African TV station. So they pulled out without anyone even noticing that they were advertising there. But the businesses have, obviously it's, they, like the rest of us, they don't want to rock the boat and they don't want to endanger people unnecessarily. They want to be supportive, but they also have operational issues that they need to look at. So this is where the global working group's going to go. And colleagues, I'm sure in Washington, know about this because there is going to be, following on from the UK roundtable, there's going to be one in Washington in a couple of weeks with State Department representatives.
Again, can I ask, Fabrice, does the World Bank or Ajit, does USAID have these kind of business networks where you can start to have these kind of discussions and test the waters, if you like, with what they are and aren't able to do? Because it is very difficult. Google did a wonderful campaign called Legalize Love. And it was a brilliant idea, and it was supported by Gaglers, as they're called, in country and so on and so forth. And they really got hostile press for it. It was very, very difficult for them, despite their fantastic intentions. Fabrice first, and then Ajit.
I think that's a really good question, Simon. What we saw in the case of Uganda and Russia and Nigeria and currently, I know the Kyrgyz Republic is looking at a similar legislation, is that we saw only very few companies taking a stance. And I think there are many issues, but one of the issues is that there is not an organization that is taking the lead in trying to federate those private companies, in sending a clear message that these laws are getting in the way of doing business in these countries. And I think, the foreign direct investment is a very powerful argument. We have a lot of companies in Australia or in Canada that are very inclusive mining companies that have great, financial interest in Africa. And the truth is that they are facing issues in sending staff abroad. And then besides that, they are proud of their global brand of inclusiveness. And, it's an issue. And at the World Bank and the United Nations, we are thinking of this issue. We have, more and more of our staff that are saying, I am not comfortable traveling to places where I'm not clear on what the impact of the legislation is going to be on me and my family. And so right now we are dealing with it on a case-by-case basis, but I think this is going to become an increasing problem.
Okay.
So, I think what would be great is to make an effort to coordinate the voices of companies like Google, IBM, airline companies, to send a clear message to a government that anti-homosexuality laws, as well as, heightened persecution of sexual minorities, make it difficult for them to do business in these countries.
Well, as you said, no gays, no theatre, I'm teasing you. We take but that's great. Thanks. I want to just get Ajit before we go to another round of questions, because we're sort of getting towards the end now. Ajit, does USAID kind of have a view about its relationship with business and the way in which it can triangulate that relationship between business and people in country?
Yes. So one of the areas that USAID recognized is that official overseas development assistance has dramatically declined, and what we're seeing is, of course, much more investment flows into countries which are from non-governmental sources. Given that reality, our public-private partnerships effort throughout the agency is working in a variety of different technical sectors, whether it's in coffee, cocoa, a variety of technical sectors that one can look at. In the LGBT sphere in particular, we have the LGBT Global Development Partnership. And this LGBT Global Development Partnership includes landscape analysis of some of the research that we've talked about, the civil society building that was mentioned earlier, and as well this work now with the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce based in the United States and with affiliates throughout the world. What we're doing as well is making sure that work with business, though, is grounded in reality. So similar to the work that Fabrice is conducting right now, we're also working with the Williams Institute to do that research. However, what I should say is all of that work is really underpinned by the alliance building within our staff and keeping our own staff up to date on policies and regulations and making sure that they're using the right language and the right terminology. We spoke earlier about, for example, ensuring that lesbians and transgender men are at the table. And I will say that when we do our training at the local level within countries, we actually draw upon those voices and will invite, for example, a community-based organization. Recently in a training I conducted, 2 lesbian women and had them participate in a training with us. So what we do then to wrap that up is working with businesses in a variety of technical sectors, have a specific effort for the LGBT arena, and constantly build allies and champions of our efforts.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's take one more round. And I'm sorry about this. It's all getting very. You've been done. No. It's too late now. No. It's one lot per person. I mean, you know. No, it's too late. It's too late. Guy in the middle. Well, no, I think that's wrong. I think there's a huge number of businesses in the UK who are actively working out what on earth they can do about this. Well,
Nigeria, they can't do it.
They don't know how to, I think, is the answer.
Nigeria have different directors, and they are not ready to
Okay.
engage with the community.
That may be true, but they may not be ready, but they do want to. They want to find a way of doing it. I'm absolutely convinced about that. I've talked to too many people who said they do.
Yeah.
Guy in the middle there.
Right. My name is Martin Pendergast. I'm from Cutting Edge Consortium, which is a UK-based network of trade unions, professional bodies, LGBT groups, progressive faith groups, combating homophobia, transphobia. I want to pick up a point I think it was Marty raised about the need to get behind the politics, and I think there's a need to get behind the processes. And so my question is, I wonder whether any of the governmental and non-governmental donor agencies either have the experience or have the capacity to facilitate some kind of space where the diversity of anthropological, cultural, religious issues around LGBT matters might be engaged in conversation with partners on the ground, with religious leaders, with grassroots communities, where there is often a gulf between what the political and religious leaders are saying and what the grassroots communities are actually doing and living in action. Also, just one more point. I don't know if people are aware, but here in London, there is a very strongly developing network of LGBT diplomats, which I know Kaleidoscope have been, because I've met some of your people.
Well, the person who left, actually, I don't know whether you know, but it was Sir Stephen Wall, who was previously the...
Well, he's not involved in it, but he will be.
But no, he will be, and there's another diplomat in the room too.
But the LGBT diplomats network is developing both a social network and a lobbying network amongst themselves on some of these issues.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. In the front here, and then...
Yes.
Yep, go for it.
Yes, thank you. My name is Ulla Bago. I'm an independent consultant. I mainly work with European Union projects, European Commission funding, but I have a long background in the Danish Foreign Service, so I'm very familiar with NORAD and all that. I just wanted to share my knowledge about this World Happiness Report. Again, getting into the multilateral arena in the political economy is quite powerful and often overlooked. Now, the World Happiness Report is a new way of measuring well-being in all the countries participating. And 2013 was the second year, the second report they published, and this year it'll be the third. And in the second year report, it goes through how happy well-being issues are in a number of countries. And then it has a specific chapter on mental health. And singling out mental health as the biggest challenge of the whole world. And you know, you've been talking about getting in from the political, the economic, the cultural, the HIV. Now, there might be a very good entry point there also. And on the business issues, also the multilateral arena has compacts on human rights with the private and business sector. So there might also be a number of things to help the whole issue there.
Who produced this report? Who was the agency or group of agency?
No, it's a UN.
It's a UN.
Sure, it's a long story. I also lived and worked in Bhutan.
Please let us find that story out on our own then, perhaps. I'm going to take the woman with her hand up there. Yes, the one I'm pointing at. Yes, please. That's right.
Okay, so I'm just going to come back to this question of
condition. Could you say who you are?
Sorry, I'm Hannah, and I work for Oxfam, although I am going to say this in a personal capacity.
Hence no surname.
So just coming back to this question of conditionality. Conditionality is a hugely politically charged word, as we all know. And civil society for many, many years has been rightly arguing that there's a big difference between conditionality of aid and then certain social safeguards and human rights protections associated with aid. And I think it's really, really important that we see the difference between those two things. There is a huge difference between a donor saying, you are going to structurally readjust your economy, by the way, probably in our interest, to saying, actually, we are going to monitor aid according to a set of human rights safeguards and principles. So I just want to ask the panel whether they support the principle of having a series of social protections and safeguards against which aid is monitored, including LGBT rights, but not exclusive to it, and whether that is the way in which we need to see this debate.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Hannah. And it's 5:05. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the White House and talk to them and ask them. And then, but if you could use this as an opportunity to say anything you also haven't said, and just some summing remarks. So Fabrice, to start with, anything, I mean, firstly, that question about changing the balance, if you like, of conditionality to this notion of social safeguards and human rights monitoring, and then any other concluding remarks you've got.
Thanks a lot, Simon. I think the question of safeguards is extremely important, right? Which is, and making the difference with conditionality is a very good point, which is that, you know, you do not want aid money to be used to discriminate against groups, you know, and that's what we felt would be the case in Uganda if we had gone ahead with our project. You know, so if you have a safeguard in place which says, you know, you cannot use international aid money to discriminate against a specific group, that would protect, you know, that would give some protection to LGBT groups, and it would also give grant to sexual minorities, you know, to call the bank, as an example, or other donors and say, look at your rules, you know, your safeguard says that you cannot use, you know, funds to discriminate against sexual minorities, yet, de facto, sexual minorities cannot go to the health center, or they cannot access, you know, this specific line of credit, or they cannot access this specific employment opportunity. The World Bank is currently revising its safeguards, which is an exercise that happens, you know, every 20 years, so it's a pretty good opportunity. I know that sexual minority groups, you know, have been engaging with the World Bank, which is amazing, to say, you know, it is time for you to have a specific safeguard that protect, you know, women and that protect sexual minorities.
Okay.
You know, it is my understanding that this might not happen, but I think, you know, it's important for sexual minority groups to take a seat at the table and say, listen, we own part of the international money. You know, we represent part of the world, and we want to make sure that your money is not being used to discriminate against us, and that we are benefiting from international efforts.
Okay, great.
And so the way I see it is that, you know, it is my hope that the World Bank in its new safeguards will have an anti-discrimination clause that will say you cannot discriminate against, you know, a group of people, including sexual minorities.
Thanks very much. I mean, Ajit?
Sure, thanks, Simon. I would say a couple of things to wrap up. Since we've heard comments and questions from our colleagues from Oxfam and CARE and others, I just wanted to say that one of the policies that USAID issued to our implementing partner organizations, those that receive funding from USAID, is that we strongly encourage them to have non-discriminatory provisions in their own workplace. For example, including sexual orientation and gender identity, and overall an inherent principle of USAID assistance is that all people, regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity, have access to services. So I just wanted to make that point since we've heard from several partner organizations. Second, regarding mental health that came up, One of the things we tried to articulate in our LGBT Vision for Action, which I recommend folks to read and is available on our policy page of the USAID website, is this issue of violence and stigma and discrimination. In the United States, the National Center for Transgender Equality found that 41% of transgender, gender nonconforming individuals had committed or attempted suicide. And it's an alarming statistic when one compares that to the general population of the needs that I think particularly transgender persons, trans men, trans women, gender nonconforming individuals face. Third, what I want to also mention is this around the safeguards and the different analytical frameworks. One tool that USAID has and that you all may access is called our ADS, the Automated Directive System. It's a bit of a bureaucratic jargon, but I simply reference it is that it really is kind of our guidebook for how we do our work in companion with a lot of the recently issued policies and strategies and vision statements. And then finally on the point that was raised earlier on LGBT diplomats, State Department and USAID have, I think, a very robust and vibrant LGBT ally organization, GLIFA, and works very much in partnership with our colleagues at the World Bank, the Globe. So we see employees and the work that they do, whether they're LGBT or non-LGBT, as really being important in this agenda moving forward.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for joining us there. Just one small nice thought here. Somebody else from Washington, but works in the World Bank as well. He's a senior economist in the health sector. In Ecuador, there is a local initiative where the Chamber of Commerce is working with LGBTI for supporting small businesses to empower LGBT leaders, but particularly transgender. So they plan to create an LGBT Chamber of Commerce pilot in Quito, the capital, to support the trans community, so it's not coming from outside companies, but local companies, big, small and medium, so it comes from inside, not outside. And Andy from PwC again said, if everyone working in this space is gay and the only way to make change is to connect locally, how do you protect LGBT people working on the ground? Are we doomed? Well, I don't think that's a good note to end on. So have you got anything more to add at this point by way of conclusion?
I wanted to address the point about conditionality and accountability, as I've thought of, or safeguards. Yeah. We would call it accountability, maybe. I think you raise a very important point, and clearly, when Norway said, invites applications for money, there will be certain criteria that have to be fulfilled. We wouldn't call it conditionality, but you have to show that you can handle the money correctly, no corruption. You have to show gender, how you're going to address gender in your project, even if it's a dam building project or whatever it is. And finally, you have to show how you will address or not harm climate, or how it deals with climate change. There are some discussions around whether human rights should be articulated more strongly in that framework. So yes, there is that discussion, and maybe none of us who come from the bilateral side have mentioned an issue which is an issue, which is the accountability back home. You mentioned it. Where, yes, whatever we do, we are also accountable to our taxpayers and to where the money came from, and that is, of course, also where the policies come from. So that's important to keep in mind. Yeah. But we also have a very, very strong relationship with civil society. So we can't we have the Norwegian civil society with their partners out, who are much more in touch with what's going on the ground than we can be, who are also not breathing down our necks because we're working very well together. But
what you're saying is there's multiple accountabilities.
There's multiple accountabilities. Right. I wouldn't call it conditionality, but certainly something to be...
Marta, a couple of concluding remarks.
Okay, so also on conditionality, given there is a direct question, do I think that aid agencies and other sort of operational organizations need to have some safeguards in place to regulate how they work, how they engage, how they fund partners? Yes, I do, and I do think that different agencies have to have discretion on how to, what they can do and how they operationalize. They got different mandate. Do I think that it would be a good idea for aid agencies to have some kind of a monitoring tools using human rights principles to monitor aid and regulate allocation? I'm skeptical. I'm skeptical on two grounds. On the coherence issue, so I can't imagine how in practice that can work out given the range of different human rights issues in different countries and how to handle that. But perhaps more substantially, I'm skeptical because I've seen too much debates in sort of development and human rights that is focused on human rights principles and how to operationalize human rights principles, and not enough on keeping the focus on human rights outcomes. So I think a more useful approach in terms of how to achieve a particular outcomes is to be quite clear about what kind of human rights outcomes we are collectively working together, and be less fixated about the fact that there are principles that need to regulate the way they work. So the sort of the normative end, but with political means, is where I see a most productive approach. And I do think there are problems with using human rights principles to determine what good aid is, because it moves away from the substance at the end. That's my view.
Thanks very much indeed. And can I thank everybody for participating, both sort of online and on the phone and so on and so forth. I mean, I think what is most interesting, the reason I gave you a slightly hard time there, BC, is that whilst those arguments aren't necessarily getting anywhere, these arguments and discussions are happening now in ways that they simply weren't happening 3, 4, 5 years ago. They're happening in diplomacy, they're happening in development, they are definitely happening in business, they are happening in politics, all over the place. And people are grappling with exactly how you deal with the fact that, I mean, Andy from PwC is very kindly just he says, I'm now the 39th most influential gay person in the world, he said, according to The Independent. Is it safe for me to go to Nigeria, Ghana and Uganda to run my business? At the moment, no one knows the answer to that. But the key thing is, and what you've demonstrated so brilliantly today, is that people are bending very clever minds to exactly this issue, whether they're activists, whether they're policy makers, whether they're people who've set up organisations, or whether they're in business diplomacy or wherever they sit. So thank you very much indeed for the dedication of your time and your intelligence and your general bonhomie to the situation. There is now a reward in the form of the typical British reward, which is some very poor wine, crammed together in a space that's far too small for you. Nonetheless, it is a present from the ODI to you, so sup it like mad. And thank you very much indeed for coming.